I'm alive. I shouldn't be.
He should not be alive. This is unfucking believable.
From the heart of trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist.
This is what government does. It sucks.
If you think you're going to win people over by stating commonplaces, you're just selling the other part.
It is about dictating every transaction that you have for the rest of your life.
Mr. Potato Head.
Coverdale is the guy to be president of the United States.
You intimidated me with your perfect 70s porn star.
That was the beginning of my problems.
He died doing what he loved, chasing a minor.
But I'll put a 50 cal attached to my Suburban.
Libertarians need to get out of New York.
The gulag is going to be in your house.
This guy's a fucking murderer. He deserves to be in a
Gotta
dungeon.
get him out of that truck at night and get him into the White House.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching another episode of The Naturalist Capitalist. I'm here with two great financial voices that many of you already listened to. We've got Clint Russell, former real estate mortgage broker and host of Liberty Lockdown. And we have Peter Schiff, the CEO of Euro Pacific Capital. Peter, thank you for joining the show again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me back on.
Absolutely. So the first question I got for you is the Fed is finally going to raise interest rates, and they say it's going to be to 2% by the end of the year. Why is that not enough in your opinion, and what should they actually be raising them to?
Well, first of all, I don't think anybody is forecasting that the rates will get all the way up to 2%. I think people are thinking maybe 1.5%. Maybe they'll get up to 2% at some point in 2023. But most people are not looking for that many hikes. In fact, if they really were going to get to 2%, they probably would have moved by more than 25 basis points in the hike that they did on Wednesday. But I think these rate hikes are really too little, too late to do anything about inflation. If anything, inflation is going to keep getting worse as the Fed is hiking rates, because even though they're hiking rates, real rates are actually falling. Because the real rate is what's important when it comes to inflation. That's the difference between the nominal interest rate and the inflation rate. And what you really need to fight inflation is positive real interest rates. You need to discourage people from going out and spending and borrowing, and you need to encourage them to delay consumption and save more. And they'll do that if they can earn a good positive return on their savings. But nobody's getting a positive return on their savings. Their savings are getting destroyed by inflation. And getting an extra quarter point or even an extra 1 or 2 points when inflation is 8% or more is not an inducement for you to save money. It encourages you to continue to spend as fast as you can to get rid of your money before it loses value. And so inflation is going to keep getting worse.
It seems as if because of what you just described, that you have to get real positive interest rates over the rate of inflation. There isn't the will, nor is there any mechanism by which they could actually do that without bankrupting the country. Is that accurate? That essentially they can't do it without going insolvent?
Well, I think the country is already bankrupt. The reason that we don't have to admit it is because the Fed's got rates at zero. I mean, that's how we're able to afford all of this debt, is because rates are so low. But if the Fed allowed rates to rise to a level that was high enough to fight inflation, it would be too high for a over-leveraged economy to withstand. In fact, the only solution that the Fed might see to the problem of too much debt is to inflate it away. And that's one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve has been creating so much inflation over the years, is that they see it as the lesser of the two evils. They think that inflation is better than default or depression, and they just thought they can control it, but obviously they can't. It's now out of control. They have a lot more inflation than they bargained for, and it's going to get worse.
Well, I think I know the answer to this question, but blame for inflation is being shifted from the U.S. economic policy to Putin and the war in Ukraine. How much of this inflation would exist without the Russian conflict?
Well, none of it has been created by the Russian conflict. I mean, Vladimir Putin, whatever bad things he's doing, he doesn't have his hand on our printing press. He's not the one that's printing money in the United States. He's not spending money. He's not signing on to any, U.S. spending bills. I mean, that's our Congress that is voting to spend this money, and it's our Federal Reserve that's printing it. They were blaming inflation on COVID. COVID didn't do anything to cause inflation. It was the way the government reacted to COVID. It was our fiscal and monetary policy that was a response to COVID. That's what caused the inflation, not COVID. And the same thing is going on with Russia. But what COVID provided the government with was an excuse. It could blame inflation on COVID. And now it's doing the same thing with Russia. And I expect this to continue as long as that situation is ongoing. Politicians will see it as a convenient scapegoat. Oh, prices are up because of Putin. They even talk about it. Putin's price hikes, Putin's price hikes. So it deflects the criticism and the blame from where it really belongs. And that's the U.S. Federal Reserve for printing the money and the U.S. Congress and the White House for spending it.
So Russia has been removed from the SWIFT banking system, but since 2014, they've been working on their own independent system through the SPFS. They've also recently been reinforcing their own war chest and making energy deals with China. My question for you is this enough to make them financially independent from the U.S. and the world banking system, or do you think it's going to fail?
No, I don't think Russia needs the U.S. banking system. And if you look at some of the allies that Russia still has, some of the countries that are still trading with Russia, including China, but also India and other countries, you're still talking about almost half the world's population. So even if the sanctions remain on indefinitely, I think Russia will be able to survive. But I don't expect, I think there's a lot of interest in Europe to bring this conflict to a resolution. So I do expect it to happen eventually. I mean, it may unfortunately linger on for a while before ultimately that happens. But I think the bigger casualty could be the status of the U.S. dollar, which I think was in jeopardy anyway because of our profligacy when it comes to spending and our excesses with money printing, our huge trade deficits and budget deficits. Ultimately, that was going to sink the dollar. But this just, adds to the problem because I don't think this sits very well. I mean, if you're China and you're just kind of observing the problems that Russia is in because of the U.S. dollar, and you're thinking, I don't want to be in a similar situation. I mean, China is not exactly our best friend when it comes to politics. There's a lot of criticism of China. A lot of people regard China as our enemy, even though they're our number one supplier of goods. And I think either China or Japan is our largest lender, our biggest banker. So we borrow so much money from China, and China allows us to consume so many goods that we don't produce, yet somehow they're our big enemy. But China knows that they're regarded as an enemy, and they may do something that the U.S. doesn't approve of. And do they really want to risk the U.S. weaponizing the dollar the way it's weaponized it against Russia? They've got way more dollars than Russia, way more U.S. treasuries. They are far more exposed than Russia is to the dollar. So if I were China, I'd be hastening my exodus from any dependence on the U.S. SWIFT system on the dollar. I'd be dumping my U.S. treasuries and my dollars. I wouldn't want to have any of my reserves in dollars. I would much rather have reserves in gold, right? Something over which the U.S. government has no control, than worthless fiat money over which the U.S. government has absolute control.
Yeah, so since 1974, we've had an agreement with the Saudis that we would protect them militarily in exchange for OPEC oil production being priced in dollars, therefore securing the dollar as the world reserve currency. But as this conflict with Russia unfolds, the Saudis won't even pick up the phone for Biden, and they've entertained the idea of pricing some of their oil in Chinese yuans. And as relations with the Saudis grow tenuous and as they grow increasingly warm between China and the Saudis, could this threaten our world reserve currency status even more than it already was?
Well, absolutely. A key to the dollar status is the petrodollar, and that's something that Nixon understood early on. When he removed gold backing from the U.S. dollar, he immediately cut that deal with the Saudis so that our dollar could be backed by their oil. Because we needed to have something behind the dollar, so you couldn't get gold for your dollars, but at least you can get oil for your dollars. And so that situation has maintained itself, and it's certainly helped to benefit the U.S. in preserving this privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency. But you're right. I mean, the relationship between the U.S. and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has deteriorated, And I know that the Saudis, looking over the political landscape in the U.S., recognize that they're not exactly that popular over here, and they could become a political scapegoat in the future for something. And, you know, right or wrong, I'm not necessarily taking the side of the Saudis. I'm just trying to see things from their perspective, that do we really want to be in this position? We have this vulnerability to the United States. Meanwhile, they can look at the ties that they have with China that are far greater today than they were back in the 1970s when this deal was cut. You know, China is far more important to Saudi Arabia. They buy a lot more stuff from China than they do from us. And, you know, China's got a big military too. Do they really need the protection of the United States? And so we could easily be driving the Saudis as well as the Russians closer to an alignment with China than they were before. And all of this is potentially detrimental to not only the U.S. dollar, but to the American standard of living that depends on the overvalued dollar for that standard.
Well, it seems as if the unipolar moment for the U.S. is kind of at its end game here, and I don't understand exactly what the game the U.S. is playing. They're using the nuclear financial sanctions options against Russia in a way that is making the Saudis and the Chinese and all these other countries basically pick sides. You know, do they want to be part of a bipolar world order, or do they want to try and play along with this unipolar moment for America still? And I don't understand the end game here. Are they, like, it seems as if we are actually playing a game of chicken where we are telling everybody else, you know, you can either still ride with America or we're going to break apart into a bipolar world order. Is that your view of things? And if so, why is it that Ukraine is worth all of this? Why are they doing it?
Well, you know, I don't know. I don't know that the Biden administration even has an end game. I think they're, you know, trying to take advantage of the crisis. You know, that's what you do in politics. Don't let a crisis go to waste, and try to use it for your political purposes. But I don't know that we have any broader ambitions than that. Maybe the Biden administration doesn't realize, you know, what they're risking here, and you know what the potential consequences are and the stakes. Because obviously, if we have these sanctions on Russia, but China is ignoring these sanctions and continuing to trade through Russia and allow Russia to use China to kind of circumvent the sanctions, now we're in a box, because now, you know, we got to sanction China too if we want the sanctions to work. But can we risk doing that? But if we don't do that, then it's going to call into question the efficacy of the sanctions. But if we do it, you know, we've taken this thing to a whole new level, and you know, we've really picked a fight that we can't win. I mean, people think that we hold all the cards in the relationship with China, but we don't. Because China doesn't need our dollars. We need their stuff. You know, they make actual stuff that Americans buy all the time and that we rely on. All we do is print money. I mean, they got a printing press. They can print all the money they want. They don't need our printing press, but we need their factories, right? We need their workers, right? So they're the ones that are in the stronger position, not the United States.
Yeah, so Peter, last time I had you on my show, you were saying that the world would not trust another fiat currency to be a world reserve currency after the dollar has let them down. And you were saying that you think it has to go back to gold. But my question is, even though that makes logical sense, do you think that's what people will ultimately choose? Because it doesn't seem that rationality has a ton to do with any economic decisions that are made anymore.
Well, it's not even really about what the people choose. It's what the governments choose as the reserve for their currency. I mean, what can they back their currency with that will have real value, that will have liquidity in the market, and that, you know, people can trust? And most of the world's central banks already own gold. And so it's just a question of shoring up their reserves and accumulating more. I mean, gold functioned as the primary reserve prior to the US dollar supplanting it. And originally, the only reason the dollar was accepted as a replacement for gold was because it was backed by gold. And not only backed by gold, but redeemable on demand for gold. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for the world to go back to that than just take a chance on another currency. I mean, I mean, why would the euro work any better than the dollar? Why would the yen work any better? I mean, even though Europe and Japan may be in a better fiscal position than the U.S., they're certainly not in a better fiscal position now than the U.S. was back when Bretton Woods was adopted. And, you know, if our economy got so corrupted by having that status, imagine what it would do to Europe or Japan. So it makes no sense for the world to just get rid of one fiat currency only to replace it with another. What the world needs is real money backing the currency. That's the only way to have real stability, to get rid of all of these massive global economic imbalances, and not to give one nation this exorbitant privilege of being able to just live off of everybody else and consume what everybody else produces and borrow what everybody else saves.
It seems to me like the CBDC, the central bank digital currency rollout that we're now seeing white papers in the US and the UK, all over the world, really, China as well, is probably the end game for what the central banks would like to do. They would like to shift from paper fiat to digital fiat. Do you think that this plan is doomed to failure and that they would ultimately end up going the gold reserve route? Because it seems like they are pretty dead set on the CBDC side of things.
Yeah, well, I can see why they'd want to do that. It just makes it easier to create inflation even faster, and it gives the government more power to micromanage the economy and spy on its citizens. So you can see why, you know, corrupt governments would be in favor of that. But it's certainly a step in the wrong direction as far as individual liberty and prosperity and freedom and privacy are concerned. So that's not a good thing, but it's certainly not an answer to the problem of high inflation, because, you know, whether you have fiat paper currency or fiat digital currency, it's the same thing. So if we are going to move to a digital currency, it needs to be backed by real money, which is easy to do. I mean, it's easier to back your digital currency with gold than your paper currency with gold. I mean, in fact, the gold standard actually would work better when married with a digital currency than it was when it was, you know, married to a paper currency. So, you know, it would work much better. And so that's where I think we're ultimately headed. I mean, the road to get there, it's hard to say exactly, but ultimately that's the only thing that I think is going to work. You know, you have certain countries that have had hyperinflation, big monetary crises. And how do they stop it? Well, they end up, you know, coming out with a new currency and they peg it to the dollar or something like that to try to, you know, restore confidence. Well, if the dollar's crashing, you know, what are we going to peg it to? We can't just say, oh, now it's pegged to the euro. I mean, that's not going to work. So when a major currency like the dollar, you know, comes into a crisis, you know, gold, I think, is the only place we can turn. And the same thing, if the crisis in the dollar sparks a crisis in the euro, or the crisis in the yen or the RMB, you know, where are these central banks going to go? They've got to go to gold. I mean, there's a fantasy out there among some of the Bitcoin maximalists that they're going to go to Bitcoin, but there's no way that's going to happen. That's just a pipe dream.
So I tend to agree with both of you that the Biden administration doesn't really seem to have an end game in mind with what's going on with Ukraine and our relations with Saudi Arabia and our energy sector. None of it makes any sense. But as let's say Saudi Arabia actually does stop pricing oil in dollars, it seems like there's nothing too bold from a military standpoint that we would be willing to do. It seems like we'd be willing to try to do regime change in Saudi Arabia or maybe Venezuela, someplace where they can price more oil. What do you see the United States being willing to do on a worldwide scale to maintain that that dominance as the world reserve currency?
Well, I don't really know what we could do. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, I don't think that we could threaten the Saudis or any other country, you know, if they moved away from the dollar. I mean, what are we going to do? Especially, you know, if, you know, they make some type of deal with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese has a formidable military. I mean, what are we going to do? So I just don't think we recognize how vulnerable we are. I mean, we're not going to go start a war. I mean, we're willing to impose sanctions, but you know, the sanctions won't work at that point. I mean, we you know, obviously the Saudis and the Chinese would be prepared for sanctions. I mean, that's not going to bother them if we even, you know, try to impose them. But ultimately, it's the world that's going to sanction the U.S. by moving away from the dollar. I mean, and taking away that privilege. I mean, that is going to be the ultimate sanction when we have to produce in order to consume. When we have to borrow, I mean, we have to save in order to borrow. That's going to be a huge eye-opener and game changer for the U.S. economy. It's a day of reckoning that we have been avoiding for years by kicking that can down the road.
Well, I think that's where we're at right now. Is that this is the day of reckoning, and all of our mechanisms to control the world via sanctions and things like that are basically losing their teeth. You know, we're no longer able to get every country to just do what we want based off of these pressures, which usually at the end of an empire that results in war. Unfortunately, we now have weaponry that can end the world if we go that route. And you don't have the option of a world war with a bunch of nuclear powers involved without it escalating to that point. Do you think that ultimately cooler heads prevail and that we pull back from the no-fly zone proposition in Ukraine, or are these people that crazy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're going to do the no-fly zone. I think, I hope we're not going to do that. I hope this situation resolves itself. But, yeah, I mean, I do think at the end of the day, I mean, the politicians are, they do act in their own self-interest. And I don't think any of them would think a nuclear war is possibly in their self-interest. And so I don't think we're going to push it that far. I would imagine that the stakes would be high enough for all parties concerned that it's not going to end up, in that situation. I mean, I hope that's the case. But maybe I'm just an optimist, although a lot of people don't accuse me of that. They think I'm being too pessimistic. But, I'm not always looking for the worst case scenario for any situation.
Yeah, so mistakes have already been made that can't be reversed on an international scale and on a domestic scale. But what would you advise to the people in charge right now as far as energy regulations go, as far as financial decisions go? What would you recommend to the government, and what would you recommend to individuals? What can they do to protect themselves in the incoming disaster?
I assume you're talking about the U.S. government.
Yes.
Certainly with respect to the oil industry and every other industry, I mean, what the government can do to help is to get out of the way, just get rid of as many rules and regulations that are impediments to the development of oil and gas, and just make it clear that the government is going to step back and stop threatening the industry with windfall profit taxes. I mean, who's going to want to invest more money in exploration and development if the politicians are threatening to take away whatever profits those risky investments may ultimately lead to? But we need smaller government. It would be nice if we had lower taxes on all companies, but we can't have lower taxes unless we cut government spending, which is something that nobody wants to do. There are some politicians, that want to cut taxes, but those same politicians aren't willing to cut spending, so they're willing to run bigger deficits and have the Fed print more money. I mean, so all the politicians have been pounding the table for inflation, and now we're reaping the consequences of that. And so if I, could be advising, I'd be giving the same advice I've always given with respect to the U.S. economy, is, when you're in a hole, you stop digging. And so let's let interest rates go up, let the free market work, force the government to cut spending, and deal with the consequences. I mean, it's not going to be pretty. People are going to lose money. Asset prices are going to fall. Companies are going to fail. But that will be the beginning of a badly needed restructuring. The U.S. economy is badly misaligned. Resources are misallocated. All sorts of malinvestment. That has to change. People have to start saving again. We have to start investing and producing. We can't run these huge trade and budget deficits. We've been delaying doing the right thing for so long that now doing the right thing is going to be a lot more difficult than had we done it a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But the longer we wait, the worse it's going to be. So just because we made the mistake of waiting this long doesn't mean we continue to repeat that mistake and wait even longer. We need to deal with the problem now, because the longer we wait to do it, the more difficult it's going to be.
I don't think any of the three of us are going to disagree with that. It's absolutely vital that we do so. However, I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that we do any of those totally pragmatic, reasonable things that you just said. So I'm curious if you ever give any thought as to how this plays out in the U.S. Do you see secession as a potential solution to this, as we have the divide between red and blue states growing ever more stark? Obviously I want it to be peaceful, but I'm just curious if you've ever considered that as a possible end game here.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could happen. I mean, there's nothing that says that 100 years from now, we're still going to have 50 United States. I mean, the Union could easily break apart. Whether that would result in a civil war or not, I would hope not. But I would think that if one state were allowed to leave without a war, a lot of states would follow. And it would probably end up being a good thing. Although I don't see, if a state leaves, what happens to its share of the national debt. I mean, maybe the U.S. government would say, hey, you can leave, but you've got to take part of the debt. But then what happens if that state just defaults and says, hey, this wasn't our debt, we're defaulting, we're starting with a clean slate. So I don't know, it's going to be very difficult. But maybe you wouldn't start to see the Union break apart until we had hyperinflation and it was pure economic chaos, and so the debt didn't even matter anyway. But yeah, I wouldn't put that past us that could happen. I mean, the problem is big government. And, the biggest government is coming from Washington, D.C. And, if Washington isn't going to roll back government on its own, then the states may decide that they need to disassociate themselves from that union so that they can liberate their citizens from government. I mean, the federal government was established to protect the states. It wasn't supposed to be involved in, the economy of the states. It wasn't supposed to be levying taxes other than during a war. And in fact, that was why we had the federal government, to negotiate treaties and to protect us if we're invaded. But it wasn't to get involved in the economy to the extent that it is. So the federal government is not fulfilling its original purpose. It is vastly exceeding the powers authorized to it by the Constitution. And so it would make sense for a state that joined the Union to secede from this Union, because it's no longer the Union that any of the states that ratified the Constitution thought that they were joining. So we'll see. I mean, I always thought if I was the governor of a state, that might be one of the things I would try to do, is go for secession and see what would happen.
Run, Peter, run. We need you.
Or at least try to tell the federal government that we were going to honor the Constitution in our state, and we're not going to allow the U.S. government to do things that are unconstitutional within our state, because right now they run roughshod over the states and they do whatever they want. And in the process, they trample over all the rights that were secured to the residents of those states by the Constitution.
So last question for you, Peter. Something that I've always appreciated about you is you tell the truth no matter who's in office. Anyone who listened to you during the Trump years would definitely not think you're a Trump supporter, and anyone who listens to you now would not mistake you for a Biden supporter. You always pointed out when the Republicans were being rhinos, when they were not being fiscally responsible, and that they would hide behind the banner of the GOP as fiscal conservatives, and you would expose them. So we're coming up on an election this year, and the political capital for the Democrats is in serious jeopardy after lockdowns and ridiculous sanctions they put on the United States over the last year and a half, 2 years. So what would you tell people who are going to the ballot box to look out for when they're voting these Republicans in? How can they know that they're going to get someone who's actually going to be fiscally responsible and actually going to try to decrease the size of the government?
Well, they're probably not. I don't have any reservations that anybody who's going to get elected is going to be fiscally responsible. But in general, I would say that the Republicans will be less irresponsible than the Democrats. Now, that's not necessarily true in every case. You can look at a guy like a Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat and who is probably less irresponsible than many of the Republicans. So it's probably a case-by-case situation. But overall, the Democratic Party, I would expect, would be more fiscally irresponsible than the Republican Party. But the key would be just to get the divided government again, just to make sure that the Democrats don't have both houses of Congress and the White House. because the Republicans tend to be a much better party when they're not in power.
Yes.
But once they have the White House and Congress, then forget about it. They're terrible. But if you have a Democratic president and at least the Republicans control one, if not both, houses of Congress, it's better, right? It's not good, but it's not as bad.
Yeah.
The 1990s.
Well, thank you for joining me again, Peter. I'd love to have you back another time. Where can people keep up with what you're doing and follow your work?
Well, anybody who wants to listen to me, I do my podcast, The Peter Schiff Show. You do 2 or 3 a week, schiffradio.com. You can listen on my YouTube channel or any place where they have podcasts. If you have wealth that you want to protect, that you don't want to see taxed away by inflation, and you want to adopt some of my investment strategies that I think will really do well in this stagflationary environment that we're in, which is going to be very different than the environment we've been in, especially when it comes to investment returns. You really have to have an unconventional strategy, not the type of strategy that people have been pursuing during the bubble. You need a whole new strategy as the air comes out. And you can work with me at my company, Euro Pacific Capital. Europac.com is the website. It's up above my shoulder. Also, Euro Pacific Asset Management. I manage individual portfolios as well as a family of mutual funds. And my funds and the separate accounts that I manage are specifically designed to do well in this environment. We're getting out of U.S. assets, out of overpriced U.S. stocks and bonds. We're buying good inflation hedge stocks, value stocks, dividend payer stocks, focusing on real things, companies that have real assets, plant and equipment, real resources, whether it's industrial metals, agricultural commodities, precious metals, companies that earn money now, not that maybe will earn money in the distant future. They have pricing power. They sell things that consumers need, and they'll keep buying them even if the prices go up, which means the dividends can go up. And I'm collecting income in foreign currencies, which I expect will appreciate against the U.S. dollar. We're investing in emerging markets, which I think will be primary beneficiaries of the dollar's demise. I think as the American standard of living goes up, the living standards in these countries will rise, and I want investments that will be tied to those rising living standards.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Peter. I will have links in the description where people can go follow you and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Same with you.
So, Clint, what do you think?
I think we're fucked, Reed. I mean, first off, I want to tell people, I have a lot of people that listen to Liberty Lockdown that are constantly asking me for financial advice. I think that if you're looking for investment vehicles, this is not financial advice, but I would highly encourage you to look into Schiff's company and what he's planning for people, because I think that the environment that he's been warning about for the past decade, that a lot of people have given him a hard time about not being right on timing, I think that that's what the next decade will look like. So he was early, but not wrong, and I think that that's the biggest recommendation I would have to people is like, don't dismiss his ideas simply because he was early. That's the same thing you could have said about Ron Paul in 2005 when he was warning about the coming real estate apocalypse. And 3 years later, he was right. So I think that's going to be the same story with Peter Schiff, is that he was early, but not wrong.
Yeah, it's funny. The first time I had you on my show, just about a year ago right now, we were actually talking about how this would all play out. And I remember Saudi Arabia was one of those key pieces on the chessboard that we weren't sure how that was going to work, because a lot of people don't realize what a significant role they play in our dominance as the world reserve currency, because they price oil on the worldwide market in dollars. So that just gives us a ton of just a huge advantage. But that seems to be slipping away without even much of a conflict. I mean, it seems to just be kind of deteriorating and no one's really doing anything about it. Are you kind of surprised that that's the way it's going and it's not really hasn't turned into a flashpoint yet at all?
Well, it has turned into a flashpoint. I mean, I think that's what Ukraine is. I think that it is the flashpoint. And
sure.
And if left to the politicians to decide, I think we will end up in war with Russia, hot war with Russia. Peter is far more optimistic about this than I am. However, I think that the people here don't have the will for it. And when I think about what it requires to win a world war, you have to have the American people on your side, or you have absolutely no chance of prevailing. So their only hope and this gets very Alex Jonesy, but I don't care, it's the truth, would have to be a false flag. They would have to run a crazy false flag to get the American people on their side. And unfortunately, I think that the American people would fall for it. You know, if there was some sort of chemical weapons attack or something like that, I think that they could probably get a majority of Americans on board with this. But
you've seen right now, it's already at 35% favorability to enter nuclear war with Russia.
Yes,
I mean, 35%, and I shared that and said this is an obvious damnation of democracy. And people were saying, yeah, it's only 35% though. Isn't that good? It's like, no, this is literal war with Russia. This isn't no-fly zone. This isn't imposing more sanctions. This isn't any like soft lead up to war. It's literal all-out war with Russia. 35% of people approve of that. And who knows if that's accurate. But if that is accurate, that's fucking terrifying because there has not yet been a false flag attack like you're talking about. So if there is, that number is going to jump up from 35%, and that's fucking horrifying.
Well, not just that, but it's not just hot war with Russia. That means 35% of people are that flippant about nuclear apocalypse. I mean, that's what we're really talking about, is a nuclear apocalypse. So the fact that it's north of 1% is astonishing to me. So the fact that there's 100 million Americans that are like, yeah, nukes, cool. Like, what are you talking about? These people have completely detached themselves from reality. And I think that this is an important point to make, is that, you know, the psyop that they put us through over the past 2 years really inclined us to be ready for something like this. You know, that people are depressed, they're anxious, they want an external enemy. You know, they want someone to focus on that's outside of their US government boogeyman to say, oh, look, this guy's worse, you know, and let's have any reason to galvanize. Let's have any reason to believe in coming together again. I think a lot of people are looking for that, but our job is to encourage people to come together as the people, to not do it on behalf of the government, and to not lead us into World War III. I mean, no one walks away from that war unscathed. That includes the wine mom in, you know, Massachusetts that thinks that it's not going to affect her. I mean, we are already being affected by this, and we haven't even gone to war. And it's just, it could get significantly worse. I mean, the financial repercussions of the lockdowns and the massive amount of printing is already extraordinary. If we actually do that, the financial system comes crashing down, and you're also at war with nuclear powers. That is a recipe that I have no interest in ever seeing come to pass. And we are this close to it, man. Like, all they have to do is a no-fly zone, and we're there. So everybody in the Liberty movement needs to be just unbelievably on fire. Like, everything that I've been about for the past 2 years with lockdowns, you need to funnel all of that energy, multiply it by 1 billion, and go when it comes to stopping this from being our future.
Yeah, because this is worse. Like, I mean, yeah, lockdowns are terrible, and the economic fallout of it has been horrific. But talk about nuclear war, it's going to be 1 billion times worse. And it's discouraging. You would think the last 2 years would have woken people up. That was my whole optimism throughout all of it, was like, wow, this is so bad that people who have never paid attention to anything suddenly have to, because it's entered their school board, it's entered their city council, it's entered their local government, so that they can't ignore it anymore. But disappointingly, it seems like a lot of people are still falling for it. And even in certain groups where we had hoped they'd become immune to this, like not just the America First crowd, but literally like the Liberty movement, there's large swaths of people gobbling this up, and that's really sad.
The former chair of the party, Nick Sarwark, you know, I
can't say I'm surprised by that one though.
Well, yeah, I know, but I'm just saying, like, that you would think, like, if there was one thing we could agree with Nick Sarwark on, World War III is bad.
Yeah, you know, if we could go back to last summer when you and I went up to the front of the room and asked him why he thought the non-aggression principle wasn't violated by theft. Now I would ask him, why do you support World War III? Because that's actually like a worse take than saying theft doesn't violate the NAP.
Oh, it's significantly worse, just because it affects all of us. Yeah. Well, here's my working thesis that I was actually thinking about this as I went to bed last night. I think a lot of people have realized the depth of the lies. Like, I think that they're starting to come to terms with that the media is lying, that the politicians are lying on both sides of the aisle. Unfortunately, I think that ultimately they don't know where to turn, and a lot of them are simply like, even though they have accepted the fact that the current political establishment is completely out to get them and lying to them and deceiving them and just abusing them, they are still holding on to this concept that it's reformable, that they can, midterms, we can get people in there that'll fix this, as opposed to just acknowledging, well, perhaps this system is fatally flawed, and perhaps, the disillusion of it is inevitable. And I think that's our job, is to try and get people to stop with the fantasy of like, oh, we're going to get, 250 Thomas Masseys in Congress, and we're going to be able to get someone in charge of the Federal Reserve to either manage it in an Austrian economics fashion, where they keep interest rates much, much higher than they've been historically, or they abolish it altogether. Like, all of these are pipe dreams. But from the MAGA side, I think that they are still, like, even though they realize how bad it is, like, I think about my mom a lot. She still thinks like I remember with the recall of Gavin Newsom, she was like, oh, he's going to get recalled so easily. Like, this is great. Like, California's going to be saved. And I was like, Mom, it ain't going to happen. And I think that that's what we're dealing with, but on a global, or not a global, but a national scale. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, to get back into a little bit what we were talking about with Peter about economic fallout. If interest rates do come up to where they're supposed to be in a free market sense, how high do you think they'd actually be? And, what would that imply for people who are in debt right now?
Yeah. Well, I disagree with Peter actually on this. I didn't want to do it on the show because I thought we only had a limited amount of time with him, but he was saying that interest rates, the Fed funds rate, has to be north of the inflation rate. And I don't think that's true, because of the leverage that exists in the system, the amount of debt that exists in the system. The people that are out buying houses for, starter homes for $1 million, if interest rates get to 4.5% on a 30-year mortgage, you're going to see a lot of people that were looking at buying that and saying, I can't buy that.
Right.
So I don't think he's correct that wouldn't slow down the inflation right away. Like, if it gets to 2.5% at the Fed funds rate, that means mortgage rates are probably around 5%. That's enough to really put the brakes on the real estate market. And if you put the brakes on the real estate market, all of those home equity lines of credit that people are using to fund their lifestyles right now, those start to dry up. And then all of a sudden it creates this cascade where people start to pull back on purchases, and you start to have more of a deflationary environment. So I don't agree with him that they have to get to interest rates higher than the actual inflation rate to prevent continuing increasingly worse inflation. But to answer your question, I mean, interest rates ought to be significantly higher than they've been over the past 10 years. Any lender, any private lender will tell you, lending out money at 30 years for under 4% is lunacy. I mean, especially when there is risk involved. Like, why would you possibly lend out your money for 3.25% for 30 years fixed? Like, no one would do that. No private investor would do that. So this entire market is predicated on a manipulation of interest rates and the price of money, which is the underlying thing that drives the economy. Like, how much can you borrow money for? It's catastrophic. I mean, it never would have happened in a free market, and now we're paying the price. But the debt levels are so high, they can't increase interest rates to the what the market would actually set them at. So it's very complex, and it's all a government problem, and it's all a part of central banking, and it all should have never happened. But now that it has, and we're so far down the rabbit hole, I'm really not sure how it plays out, but I think it's going to be catastrophic either side, whether it become a deflationary bust because they hike interest rates too aggressively, or we end up with continuing stagflation or hyperinflation. It's going to be very painful for the American people.
Yeah. So what do you think about when I asked him what the United States military would be willing to do to preserve that reserve currency status? I think he's right that they can't do a ton. What do you think they'd be willing to try, though?
Oh, I think that this is another thing I disagree with him on, and I think that he's being overly optimistic, but I hope he's right. I really, really hope he's right. I think they're willing to do anything, man. I think that they're willing to have a no-fly zone if the central bankers that that really run the world tell the American politicians, which they own, to have a no-fly zone and go to war with Russia and risk a nuclear exchange, I think they'll do it if the American people will allow it, if that's what the central bank guys think they can get away with. So I hope that's not what they want. I hope that the Great Reset is not a euphemism for nuclear holocaust. Right. But I'm not at all convinced that it isn't. You know, a lot of these people believe in population control. They are some really sinister folks, and they have bunkers. They have, you know, tons of money where they can probably be safe, even if it ends up being a total catastrophe where, say, Russia were to drop a nuke on Georgia or something, you know, one of these countries, just to like send the message to the United States that we're not going to be invaded, we're not going to be messed with forever. I mean, this is all on the table, you know, and I really, really do genuinely appreciate Peter's optimism, but I am not at all certain that.
Never thought I'd hear anyone ever say that sentence. I do appreciate Peter Schiff's optimism.
Well, I mean, just on this topic.
Yeah, just on
this. Otherwise, I mean, I think I agree with him that it's unlikely. You know, I do think it's unlikely, because I think that if Russia feels pinned down and they feel as if they have no options and they use a nuke, well, mutually assured destruction is still on the table. And I'm not at all certain that the U.S. government wouldn't fire all of them. You know, I don't know. So, God help us if it happens, man. I really think it's unlikely, but the fact that it's even a potential, and that there are people in America that are advocating on behalf of that potential is just horrifying to me, much less that there are libertarians.
Shit.
Jesus Christ.
So let's say we don't go into nuclear war, and let's say Saudi Arabia does end up pricing its oil completely in yuans and just like giving the United States the middle finger, and we don't do anything about it. We don't try to overthrow somebody in South America to get more oil exports, or we don't try to, you know, do regime change in Saudi Arabia. We just kind of let it all happen. What could the United States do to try to maintain any sort of relevance on the global market? If that goes away, well, we'd have to overhaul our business sector here at home. We'd have to abolish tons of regulations, start producing the shit out of stuff again. But what would that actually look like in your mind if that actually unfolds?
Yeah, I don't think they do any of that, honestly. I think that the CBDC push becomes the real play at that point, you know, where they just say, okay, well, we still have the majority of the world trading in US dollars. We're going to be the first to really perfect the CBDC, and we're going to have it be so ever present that it's just going to be the easiest thing for people to glob onto, and pray to God that that's enough to keep the power of our reserve status in play. I think that's if they don't go the militaristic route, I really think that's the only outlet they have, and I think that's why they've been, you know, floating the idea so much as of late, is that like they realize, like, and I disagree again with Schiff on this, that he said that the Biden administration doesn't have an end game. I don't think that that's true. I mean, well, Biden himself doesn't, and Psaki herself doesn't. Like, these people are all idiots and they're actors. Puppets. But I'm talking about the people that really run this show. I think it's a little bit foolish to think that they don't have some game plan as to what they're trying to do. Like, I do think that the people that put those people in power absolutely have a game plan, and they are trying to win it. You know, they are trying to be the source of omnipotence into the next era. And it's just that the problem is all of our lives are caught up in this power struggle between the CCP and Putin and Russia and Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Power structure and the bankers. Like, we are all caught up in the middle of it, and it's just God, I just don't know how it. I honestly, I don't know how it plays out. If I did, I'd be a billionaire, because I'd play the right side of it and, you know, ride it to glory.
Yeah, so I'm at the point where I think the only way forward is forms of soft secession, because I don't really see a top-down fix to this anymore. You know, I used to believe in trying to get, you know, a good president in there and then getting good people in Congress and, you know, dismantling this system and building it back the way it's supposed to be. That's completely gone. I don't think that way at all anymore. I think the only power you have is from the bottom up.
Right.
And that's why I'm moving back to New Hampshire, going to contribute to the Free State Project, do everything I can to bolster the independence of New Hampshire. Anything, I mean, I'm also for actual secession, but anything that can move us in that direction. It seems, having moved to Florida, that you feel the same way, that there's no way to undo this from the top down, that this requires local activism and protecting yourself and your community. Is that pretty much where you are?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's exactly how that last question I had with Schiff. It's like, I don't think that this is reformable. I don't think that you can actually get all these Massies in office and save us. You know, like I don't see it happening on a federal level. And honestly, like I don't really trust DeSantis, but he's a 1 trillion bajillion times better governor than Gavin Newsom was. So I had to go and live out my principles and be somewhere where someone respected my bodily autonomy and respected some of the demands that I have. And ultimately, you know, if the federal government were brazen enough to have intervened in that in a way that made it so that, you know, he couldn't preside over my decision making, well, then that's the end of the United States. You know, that's the end of states' rights. That's the end of having any sort of protection on the state level, in which case I would have either fought or fled the country, which is what I've said many times. I would have probably just left, because I don't think there's enough people here for us to prevail in any sort of conflict. So that's my belief, is that a soft, peaceful secession is the only path for a peaceful resolution to what ails us. I really believe that. And I think that us, you know, Malice and Dave and all these other people that have been popularizing the idea of late have done us a great service in that. And I hope that it becomes less and less fringe. And I hope that the left starts to really consider it, you know, that they have such animus towards us. Yeah. Why not let us go? You know, right. Like why don't you want California to be its own country? Like you guys don't share the values of like 75% of the land mass of the United States. Why do you want to be with us anymore? Just let us fucking go. We don't want conflict, but we happen to be really armed. So like, do you want conflict with us? Like, do you? And just kind of play a game of chicken and see if we can come to a peaceful resolution because of it.
Yeah, I've become a Kaufmanite, I'm going to call it. Like, just listening to him over the last year, he's really convinced me that he just brings libertarianism to its most absolute form. You know, you and I and all, well, not all libertarians, as we've been discussing in here, but any good libertarian doesn't want to try to control the state of Iraq or the state of Iran or whatever. Like or
Ukraine
or Ukraine. Like, we're just like, whatever, it's your business, not ours. We're going to stay out of it. Jeremy Kauffman has convinced me that that's the way we have to be about the United States too. Like, I'm at the point, I don't care what California does. If they want to become a communist hellhole, as long as they're letting people leave, I really don't care. Right. And I actually encourage them to do that now. It's like, fine, become as crazy as you can, and you'll deal with you'll deal with the consequences of it on your own. And then places like Florida, New Hampshire, South Dakota, anywhere where you know, they're at least moving more toward liberty, hopefully they can be beacons of freedom, inspiring other people to either move there or become more like them, which is exactly what we would like the United States to be on the world stage. But so many people still have this statist mentality about this country. Like 250 years ago, you know, we had a Declaration of Independence and we crafted a constitution. And because of that, we all need to be united in this, and we all need to be the same, and we need to, I just don't think that anymore. I'm just like, fuck it, I don't care. You know?
No, I'm with you, man. And I think that was the idea of the country at its founding, was that you would have these 50 laboratories of innovation. Oh, I mean, it wasn't 50 back then, but you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Where you got to try different governmental models, and you got to try different economic policies and things like that, and you could see which model worked best for the people. And then if you liked one that was a state over, you could move there. And it was like that is great. And I think that the sad truth is that as the United States itself became more and more anti-freedom, more totalitarian, really, that shining city on the hill, that example to the world, that example even from a state level to a state level, where, you know, you could say, okay, Florida is so much better than California or New Hampshire is, all of that started to go away because on a federal level, we started to look so similar to all of these totalitarian dictatorships that we were fighting over our past 100 years or so, and now the difference between the two is so minimal. Like it really is. I'm sure I'm going to get accused of being a Putinite for saying this, but let's be honest. Like, is there a clear good nation when it comes to a U.S. versus Russia fight? Like, in terms of what we've actually done to the world in terms of warfare and invasion, imperialism, all these things.
Honestly, I'm going to say Russia looks like the good guy if you have to choose one.
if you had to choose one, sure. Yeah. But I would say it's clear that neither are a good guy.
Right.
But yeah, in terms of like which is worse, well, yeah, the U.S. has been way worse. we just couch it in these pro-freedom, pro-democracy type of argumentation, but it's all propaganda, and we all know that it's just a lie. So there is no longer a country that's really been an example of anti-interventionism or non-interventionism and pro-free markets and pro-human liberty for which the world to compare itself to. And I think that that's a huge failing of the United States, in that that's what we were, and we aren't that anymore. And now we are paying the consequences because the entire world looks like us and we look like shit. So that's the new paradigm that we're dealing with. And I don't think people have really come to terms with it.
All right. The last thing I want to ask you about, and I don't want you to badger him too much because he's not here to defend himself anymore, but I know you disagree with Peter on Bitcoin.
Yes.
I'm kind of in between you guys, to be honest. I'm not a Bitcoiner, but I think he's been too pessimistic toward it. Like, I mean, obviously he said it'll never reach X, it'll never reach X, and it keeps reaching X. I think he could be right that it's a bubble, but I think it's a bubble that could last 100 years. I mean, who knows? Right. So you obviously can make money off of Bitcoin. And he's said that too. Like, obviously, if you bought Bitcoin in 2017, you'd be a lot richer than you were when you bought it. But without badgering Peter too much, just what do you think about Bitcoin? I know you're much more optimistic about it than he is.
Yeah, I mean, because of the fact that it's being adopted so globally, I think that it's a mistake to just assume that it's a bubble because it's not backed by anything, which has been essentially his take on it, that it's kind of like fiat. I agree with much of his argumentation about it. I think that there are real questions as to why Bitcoin versus why other cryptocurrencies, if they're not backed by anything, why is Bitcoin clearly better? Well, in this situation, it's basically just about the network effect, and that it is being utilized by so many millions of people, if not a billion people, probably over the world. And it's like, well, that has to be paid attention to. Like, you can't just dismiss it and say, well, because it's not backed by anything, it's just as worthless as paper currency. Well, the fact that it has a limited supply automatically makes it worth more than fiat, in my view. And I think that you're witnessing that firsthand in its market value. So whether or not Bitcoin becomes the reserve currency of the world, which I think it's ultimately like, it's either going to be that or it's going to be a bubble. Like that's my personal take on it. I think it's a mistake not to hedge there, to not be a participant in it in some fashion. I think that a decentralized currency on a blockchain is ultimately the future of currencies and probably fiat currencies globally. So it's so early, dude. Like that's the other mistake people make. It's like, this technology has been around for a dozen years. Like, why are we pretending to know whether or not this is ultimately viable, ultimately capable of being the reserve currency, ultimately capable of being either implemented in the governmental system or completely outside of it? Like, I think that that's a possible future for it too. Like, you could see complete universal bans on all non-CBDCs. Like, that is a distinct possibility, and I think Bitcoiners don't give that enough credence either. So like, I have critiques for everybody involved with this topic, and I think that basically my take on it is that hedging there makes a ton of sense, and if you're not doing it, I think that's a huge mistake. But also, because there have been dips, I always tell people, if you're going to hedge, make sure that you buy on a dip. Wait, because we've seen so many massive pullbacks. When it was at 70, people thought it was going to 100. Well, now it's then it dropped all the way back to 30, and now it's back up to 44 or whatever it is today. And I know pricing in dollar terms upsets Bitcoiners, but when you're talking about transitioning from fiat savings holdings into another asset class, well, the acquisition price makes sense and it matters. So I think it's stupid to be mad about that. Hey, basically what I'm saying is I have beef with everybody on this topic. Everybody is too they're too hard-headed on it. Yeah, it's like there's some sort of religious war with this topic that I don't really appreciate, and I just think that people ought to be learning as much as possible. They ought to be probably hedging there and keeping an open mind, because I think that the story is yet to be written.
Is there anything else you wanted to comment on as far as the discussion went that I haven't mentioned?
Not really. I just wanted to mention that I have another big Austrian econ type guy, a la Schiff, on that episode will be out tonight. So probably the same time you put this out, with Andrew from Nomad Capitalist. And we talk more about expatriation and becoming an expat and things of that nature. So if you didn't find the solutions from this episode with Schiff, I think that's a worthwhile one to check out. So anybody can go search for Liberty Lockdown on YouTube or your podcatcher. So thank you so much, man. Honestly, God, this was like a bucket list item for me. I have listened to Schiff for so many years. I really think that he is he's a brilliant guy. He really understands. He's really trying to problem solve too. You talked about Kaufman. I think that Schiff is great in that he is doing many of the same things in terms of his own professional career, where he is trying to build lifeboats for people. And he may not talk about that very much because ultimately he's a capitalist and he's trying to profit on his side too. But what he's doing is providing value to the world, and we need a hell of a lot more of that.
Yeah, 100%, man. And I'm really glad I had you on. I think this was a great three-way conversation. I'd love to do something like this again sometime. I know you've got a big...
Anytime you want to do a three-way with me, I am in. You know that.
I know that all too well. I know you got a big week coming up. What's going on Liberty Lockdown in the next few days, and where can people keep up with that?
Yeah. Nomad Capitalist tonight, Dave Smith Sunday, scheduling with Roger Stone. I don't know exactly what date that is. And also in talks with Jack Murphy to try and get him on. He hasn't been doing any shows in a long time. And I really think that he has a lot of value to add. So I hope that he's willing to come on. I'm obviously not going to talk about any of the controversy shit. I think that that's dumb and pointless, but I would love to talk to him about his view of the world. He had an incredible guest on about a week ago where they talked about kind of the Thucydides trap that we're in with China and how Russia and the Ukraine situation is all part of that. So I would love to get his take there. So yeah, that's the lineup. And then also I'll be speaking at the Ohio Libertarian Party, Texas, and I think Michigan. So that's all in April. So if anybody wants to come out and see me talk live and have stage fright and shit my pants, that'll be a blast. Thank you so much for having me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody, I will also tentatively be having Roger Stone on the show. Clint and I lucked out. We had Chase Geyser hook us up with that connection. So that'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Shout out to Chase.
Yeah, Chase is awesome. Make sure you go check out his podcast. He's the One America podcast. And yeah, thank you for watching the show, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and look in the links in the description to follow me on Odyssey and all the audio platforms, and Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that happy stuff. And
subscribe to Reed's audio podcast, people. I am sick of you only watching him on YouTube. I know he's handsome, but he's also got those sweet pipes. Go subscribe to his audio right now.
Thank you. Yeah, Clint went the opposite way. He started with audio. I started with video, and it seems like nobody's caught on that there is an audio version. There is, so go check it out. And I have a microphone now. I'm not just like talking at a computer from 5 feet away anymore, so you could actually understand what I'm saying. So go check it out.
He's no longer talking through a can on a string, so you gotta check out the audio version.
All right, thanks, Clint.
Thanks, man.
From the heart of Trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist,
This is what government does. It sucks. It is that perfect mixture of inept and conniving.
Some of my closest relationships are now ruined.
If you think you're going to win people over by stating commonplaces, you're just selling the other parts.
If you are just contrarian, you are by default going to be wrong, because they're always going to have some tidbit of truth.
It is about dictating every transaction that you have for the rest of your life.
Libertarians need to get out of New York. They need to get out of California.
Insurrection at Capitol Hill.
That was the beginning of my problem.
Riverdale is the guy to be president of the United States.
No one's willing to change anything about themselves to get there.
But I'll put a 50 cal attached to my Suburban.
And he died doing what he loved, chasing a minor.
This guy's a fucking murderer.
The gulag is going to be in your house, completely estranged from everything but propaganda. Pearl Harbor was not a surprise, and Saddam did not have nuclear weapons.
Unless you solve the central problem, then we'll be fighting over Mr. Potato Head forever.
He should not be alive. This is unfucking believable.
Gotta get him out of that truck at night and get him into the White House.